So either you thought ahead and you wore the same shirt as we did in part one, or you only have one shirt. Which one is it?
I've got a lot of shirts. I think this was kicking around since last week. I kind of, because one of those things, where you wear a shirt for an interview, so it's not really totally worn and needs to go for a wash basket. You haven't been out with it. You just sat down for an hour, but at the same time, it's not back in the closet with the clean shirts.
I dig it.
In the halfway house, kind of.
I dig it. It's in the halfway house, right?
So I kind of grabbed it, like I was like, oh, that'll do, yeah.
No, I like it. When I worked as a lawyer, they would say, always keep a suit in your office. And I'd be like, well, okay. And then I got to remember to get it dry cleaned. And let me tell you, when you're 26 years old and you're working a 80-hour-a-week job, you're just wearing the same dirty-ass suit and shirt and pants and whatever that you've kept in your office for like 8 months. And not every day, but, it gets disgusting. But I'm very familiar with the purgatory of clothing that is like your interview shirt. The problem is when you do interviews every day like I do, the interview shirt gets you have to burn it eventually.
So you're a lawyer?
I am technically, yeah, but I mean, I would advise against retaining me for anything important because I don't know what I'm doing at all. I just do the podcast now.
There is an issue which I was thinking I needed to speak to an American lawyer about. Maybe I'll ask you about it later. Maybe not while we're recording, but it's kind of sensitive. But yeah, there was an issue of something reporting on something I wanted to do, and I was wondering if I was going to get into legal trouble with this. So,
I know plenty of criminal defense lawyers who can tell you whether or not something, and federal prosecutors and things like that can be like, that's going to be this, and you don't want to do that. That might be the person that I should refer you to. But yeah, I'm happy to help. Just remind me, shoot me a WhatsApp after this or whatever.
Sure. No, I'll have to think it through anyway. But anyway, all good. So,
all right.
So far away. So what were you working as a lawyer? You actually defending people and stuff?
Oh, no. I was a financial paper pusher. Do you know what mortgage-backed securities are?
A little bit.
Yeah. So those big like financial derivative nonsense that screwed up the whole economy. So I was working in that, but I was so young that I was just like, oh, I'll work wherever they're going to hire me, which is generally a good idea after you get out of a $155,000 educational program, is just take whatever job pays you the most money.
Yeah.
Or a reasonable amount of money, I should say. And so I just joined up where they were hiring, and where they were hiring was frickin' doing spreadsheets and screwing up the economy. I didn't at least understand it at the time. I got a feeling for it early on because I was like, what happens if all these people stop paying their mortgages because they can't really afford them? And they're like, well, that's never going to happen. How many people default on a mortgage? It's really rare. And then, of course, what we found out was the mortgage guys were selling anybody with a pulse a mortgage they could never afford because rates were so low, and they would just give tons of credit to people because they got paid. So then we took those mortgages and we turned them into like a public, almost like a publicly traded company, right? So you'd take tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of these mortgages from, like, let's say Chase Bank, and you would turn it into Jordan Harbinger Mortgage Company. It obviously wasn't really my mortgage company, but it would be like Mortgage Loan Pool, and you'd trade it on NASDAQ or some stock exchange, and people would invest in the returns that those mortgage pools were getting. But the problem is, if the economy turns down, which is what happened, and the real estate bubble pops and people go, well, I'm not going to pay you a mortgage on a house where the value of the mortgage is twice the value of the house, right? The house is underwater. It's worth less than I'm paying for it. So they just stop paying, or they can't afford to pay. And then that entity, that company, it would be like if Coca-Cola just went, oh man, we can't make that Coca-Cola stuff anymore. Have you tried Dasani bottled water? And everyone goes, ugh. The stock value goes way down, and then that thing gets bankrupted. But the problem is all the banks and all the law firms and all the investments, everything, all the investment companies, that's all they do. So the banks fail, the market fails, the mortgages fail, the real estate market fails, all the law firms fail all at the same time.
Yeah. I watched the Big Short. So I kind of do you think I was well done, the movie?
Yeah, I mean, look, as a junior associate, I only understood it, and someone who's really high up is going to go, that explanation was meh. That was probably a 30,000-foot overview. The Big Short was interesting. Of course, it's dramatized, but I'm not in it enough. I was not in it enough to go, oh, that's not how that happened. I have no idea. I was an overpaid secretary. And what I mean by secretary is my secretary was awesome. She was useful. I was not useful, and neither was anybody else at my level. We were really, most of the assignments I got were, can you make sure that there are actually 10,000 parking spaces in all of these parking garages? And I'm like, 1, 2, 3. I mean, that's an actual assignment I got because I'm looking at blueprints all day or schematics. Other things I had to do, make sure that a document that was 900 pages long, not exaggerating, was readable. So I read a 900-page document about liquefied natural gas ports in like Sri Lanka that are being constructed. I mean, that's what you do when you're a first or second year associate and you are, dumb. So, yeah.
Getting paid.
Yeah, getting paid, man. Yeah. Getting paid and figuring out that I didn't want to be a lawyer. I'm actually it's funny. I'm quite thankful for getting that experience because I worked with really cool people. I worked with really smart people that were so different from me that I realized I'm probably never going to be truly successful in this field because I'm nothing like these guys. Not because, they're just so smart and I'm never going to be. They're interested in so many different things that I would never enjoy. Their brains worked in totally different ways. And I was like, what do all those people at the top of this have in common that I don't enjoy and don't have in common? And there were so many things that I thought, I'm not the type of person who's going to enjoy being at that level. I'm not the type of person who's going to enjoy getting to that level. And I'm not the type of person who's going to be naturally talented at getting to that level. And so then getting really boring assignments was just the icing on the cake for me to be like, what else is out there in my life? And is it worth taking a 50% pay cut to do something that I enjoy? And so when I got the radio gig and I was doing my podcast, I was on Sirius XM satellite radio, which is like satellite radio. You're familiar?
I used when I was driving around, in fact, doing some research for the gun book and driving around a bunch of places in the US, and I rented a car which had Sirius. So I was listening to all the stuff there. It was some good stuff. I was listening to one like a throwback, like retro grunge station, and one retro hip hop station.
Yeah, so they have everything.
Yeah. So the retro hip hop, which kind of shows I'm old listening to retro stations, but the retro hip hop was called Rock the Bells, and it was like 80s and 90s hip hop, and the retro grunge was like called it was named after the Nirvana song, Lithium, whatever it's Lithium.
Oh, Lithium, yeah. Lithium, yeah. I'm familiar. Yeah, the station names haven't changed much. Yeah. So I was doing talk. I was on what's now, or it was called Stars. And before that, it was Maxim because it was like dude bro stuff. So I got on there and I was like, this is fun. I like it. It doesn't pay as much. But then we got a prime drive time slot and they were like, hey, you're pretty good at this. And I thought, okay, I've never studied this. I've only done this for 6 months or a year, whatever, by that time, probably a year. And I'm already in this Friday night drive time radio slot on Sirius XM satellite radio on a big station. That's a pretty good sign that I should maybe pursue this, especially because none of it felt like work. None of the show prep felt like work. All of it was fun. I was excited to do it every single day. So that was kind of a wake-up call for me where I was like, maybe the law thing is just something I did because I didn't know what else to do with my life. And that was actually 2020 hindsight, 100% true. I only went to law school because I was like, how do I get a job? Nobody told me how to get a job. Yeah. And this company is going to give me a job that's paying me more my first year than my parents made combined at the peak of their careers. And that's before my annual bonus that I get. Like, what's going on here? I'll take it. I'll figure it out. I'll build the airplane on the way down. And they didn't care if I was going to enjoy it or anything. They were just like, you're qualified for it because you graduated from Michigan law and we are looking for people who have these kinds of grades and, you're going to fit in well here. And I thought like, well, TBD on that. But it was a good experience, man. I'm sure it's probably like when you're a writer and you start off by writing copy for a furniture catalog and you're like, this sucks, I hate my life. But then 10 years later, you're writing El Narco or living in like Somalia, writing about Al-Shabaab. And you're like, oh, now I understand why I needed to spend a year writing blurbs about upholstery.
Well, journalism's a very curious trade, and it's only got more weird and messed up in the time that I've been in it. But it's still fun. But anyway, I'm all good to go. But I've got to try and actually write a TV script as well for this documentary series.
Cool. Good for you. Gun trafficking, huh? How about that?
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. So whenever you want to go.
So yeah, let's talk about gun trafficking, the Iron River, as you called it in the book. And this, at first I thought, oh, the Iron River, it sounds so Game of Thrones, right? But then you wrote there was something like 200,000 guns going from the U.S. to Mexico every year, which I read that and then I rewound it and then I listened again and I rewound it and I thought, wait, every year 200,000, that can't be right because the number is so insane. It sounds like what you would need if you were fueling an insurgency in Iraq.
Yeah. The number's mind-boggling. And I mean, that's estimates. I mean, but you look either way. So you've got estimates and there's this big study that was carried out and it tried to look at it like the sales in certain areas of gun shops, how they were very abnormal, particularly gun shops right on the border with Mexico. But then you look at the hard numbers. So you look at the very solid numbers of guns that are being seized from cartels in Mexico, from gangsters in Mexico, and directly traced to, US gun shops and gun factories. And you find over a 12-year period about 160,000 of those. So that's already a very, very big number we can be totally sure about. But then you look at some of these things and like the Fast and Furious guns, and we can get into that particular juicy scandal, the Fast and Furious thing. But in the Fast and Furious guns, then you had a kind of, in some ways, a kind of controlled experiment where you had 2,000 guns and you saw only a pretty small percentage of those were recovered. So that gave you an indication of only a small percentage of guns that you are following being trafficked are really out there. Now, Fast and Furious obviously was a huge botched operation by the government, which many people see as being, well, they were deliberately doing this to try and show how bad the thing was. We can get into that later. But like the either way, the numbers are huge. It's mind-boggling. You see this around. I mean, you see just the armaments that cartels have. That you can see again and again and again, daily, these people, these killers, these paramilitary style cartel groups with, where they can have 50, 100 people with AR-15s, AK-47s and see where they're coming from. Now, this is a, kind of mind-boggling scale of this thing. But for me personally, for a long time, I was hesitant to write a book specifically about this issue. And one of the reasons, I came across this issue pretty early on, as we were discussing in the first episode of the podcast. I've been 20 years in Mexico, 21 years in Mexico now, covering this cartel violence. Pretty early on, I bumped into this issue of the firearms coming from the United States and had a story about this in the Houston Chronicle back in 2004, looking at it right back then about these guns coming over. That was before the real increase. And I had other stories for the Associated Press and various people over the years. But I was hesitant to write a book about this because I was thinking, well, you have the Second Amendment in the United States, and this is such a powerful thing that, what difference does it make? People have got the right to bear arms. They're going to buy guns and bring them to Mexico. And also, when I saw things like Sandy Hook happened in 2012, and it's like, well, in the United States, there's no room to debate on this. There's kind of like, even when children are being shot in a school, there's no movement about this. Now, this changed in 2017, when in my own research, I came across, for a radio documentary I was doing, a gun trafficker in prison in Ciudad Juarez, and had a long interview with a guy convicted, arrested by the military for bringing a whole bunch of firearms, AR-15s mostly, from Texas, from Dallas. He was buying them, taking them down into Mexico, doing it every weekend. And I talked to him in a lot of detail about how he got into this, what he was doing, what his modus operandi was. And I realized there's a lot to this, even beyond the Second Amendment. There's a lot into these details because actually there's a lot of kind of holes in these laws or law enforcement which is not happening, even beyond the issue of right to bear arms or not. So, for example, he was going to Dallas to gun shows, and he was buying them. And he said, "Oh, well, there's a black market at gun shows, so I can buy them with no paperwork at all, no paper trail. I walk in there, I buy 12 to 15, mainly AR-15s every week, every weekend, and take them down to Mexico." And what he was doing was, so I went up there, with a colleague, and we took a recorder, and we're recording in the gun show, and we're recording the people and people talking to us. And we realize what you have this, it's known as the private sale loophole, but it's also this abusing even the private sale loophole, which some people call the gun show loophole. But you have a case where supposedly a private sale is exempt from background checks and from paperwork. The same way that if I'm, you're just going to sell me an old microphone, you don't have to be a registered microphone seller. You're just going to,
Right.
I'll give you $100 for that microphone. No paperwork involved. But people were abusing that. And you had people with tables full of brand new AR-15s selling them with no paperwork. So they were saying, well, I'm a private collector. But you're not a private collector. You're in the business of selling guns.
Right. You're reselling the weapons.
You're buying and reselling without even using. So you're basically in the business of selling guns without a license, which is a crime, and which the ATF do send undercover agents in to try and look for. Now, there's documented cases, and I found one down in Florida of someone selling more than 1,000 guns this way.
Wow.
And selling them, and then they eventually went and got them on tape. But selling these, and very aware selling to the cartels. But then you see, and so the more I got into this, I said, "Oh, there's quite a lot there there's quite a lot of meat there to get into. It's not as simple as the Second Amendment." Another case, there's only one of the biggest ways that these cartels are acquiring the firearms is through what they call straw buyers, straw purchases. You got a clean record, I pay you some money, you go there and buy the guns for me. Now, they're only paying them often things like $100 to buy a rifle, $50 to buy a pistol, $500 to buy a big. And the reason it's so low is because the recommended punishment is probation. And you see these people go in and they're buying. There's one case where a guy went in, bought 10 AK-47s, identical weapons. So he's buying, okay, I'll have 10 of those. Obviously, something suspicious. You're buying 10 Romanian-made AK-47s, buying them for a guy who was working for a Mexican cartel, the Zetas, supplying the cartel. The cartel used them in the murder of an American agent.
Oh, wow.
So even an American agent being killed with these guns, the guy still only got probation.
Wow. So so the people who are doing this go, you're not going to get caught. This is an inconvenience at best for you.
Yeah.
And that's even if you get caught. So here's $100. Go get me a pistol and just don't ask any questions about what I'm going to do with it, or an AK-47 in this case, or 10 AK-47s.
Or it's a lot worse than that. Go and buy me a gun. I mean, there's cases on the you can document it, of people who've gone around spending $500,000 in shops, go around like just buying for the cartels. So there's a lot more going on with this issue than simply, okay, the Second Amendment exists, it's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a failure in the basic enforcement of this issue that even many, gun owners, many pro-Second Amendment people can be like, well, actually, yeah, I want my guns, I want the Second Amendment, but I don't want this massive sale of guns to the cartels.
Yeah,
so
I'm sympathetic to that. I'm not one of those people who's like, ban. I know I'm going to get some flack for this. I don't think we should ban all firearms from the United States. I don't think that's going to work. I think we have gun culture. It's just, the toothpaste is out of the tube. But I think a lot of people, in fact, I'd wager, and this is back of the napkin here, most gun owners probably want something akin to, hey, maybe we shouldn't let people go in and buy 10 AK-47s as a straw buyer for drug cartels. Like, maybe there should be a little bit of fill out this form and come back tomorrow because we need to make sure that you are not a supplier of illegal weapons that are going to get people killed. I mean, it's still, you can even have the low bar to gun ownership. You just need a bar to gun ownership. And again, this is not a Second Amendment episode, and I'm unqualified to talk about that particular angle. But this, when we talk about the iron river of guns flowing south, at those numbers, that's hardly hyperbole, right? And so are those 200,000 guns that are being trafficked to Mexico each year, is it safe to say those are all for cartel warfare? Because it's nearly impossible. Ed Calderon told me it's almost impossible to buy a gun legally in Mexico. So this isn't people buying for home defense or sport, right?
Right. So you have to buy a gun legally in Mexico, and it's another thing that people might find surprising. So there's many things. So when I got into this issue and I realized, after this first interview with this guy, that actually there's a lot of meat on this issue, a lot of weird things happening. So I spent 4 years just diving into this issue of gun trafficking. I went all the way to Romania, to the factory that made these AK-47s, which then get imported to the United States and then sold in Mexico. Found people all over the industry, found a gun, some, hardline people who support the Second Amendment, the president of the Alaska Machine Gun Association, and then as well as the victims and people, campaigning all over this issue. So you find there's a lot there. Now, one of the things I found many surprises. I mean, many surprises about this. I've had all these things that, came at me. The fact that, one of them was that you can't trace a gun digitally. If literally a smoking gun is found at a crime scene in the United States. So literally, here's the smoking gun, the body's right there, phone up the gun trace center. And a lot of cops don't know this. They told me the gun trace center. You phone up the gun trace center, here's the serial number. Give me a trace. We can't do that. We're not allowed to digitally trace. We're not allowed legally to have a digital record of firearms.
Wow.
You can't in the same way you can have of car license plates.
So there's no digital database for the ATF to say this gun was purchased in an Illinois gun shop and then it moved to California with the owner and then it got stolen in Nevada from a car. There's nothing like that.
Absolutely not. So what they have to do, and it's quite an amazing place to go to. This is the ATF Trace Center in West Virginia. They have to make phone calls. They make a phone call to the company which made the gun. Say, who did you sell it to? Oh, we sold it to this, or where did you distribute it? Oh, this shop here. Phone up the gun shop. Who did you sell it to? Oh, this person. Now, if they resold it in a private sale, or it was stolen.
That's it.
That's it anyway. If the shop goes out of business, they give the paper records to this ATF Trace Center. However, the ATF Trace Center is not allowed to digitize them. So they have these massive mountains of paperwork. And they're trying to find these kind of weird ways of getting around because they cannot have a searchable database. And these things, like, you get into this, it gets these interesting things about gun law, and even the Second Amendment from a legal point of view is a lot more complicated. You get debate about the Second Amendment. You get these different federal laws, the 1934 law, the 1968 law. You get these different state laws. So it's actually very, very complicated.
Yeah.
Gun law in the United States is not super simple. I thought Second Amendment. It's actually very, very complicated. But anyway, getting to Mexico, another thing. So we asked about buying a gun in Mexico. In Mexico, it might surprise people, there is a constitutional right to bear arms in Mexico.
There is one.
There is one, yeah.
Wow.
In the Mexican Constitution of 1917. However, now that is a bit, in some ways, more clearer than the US Second Amendment, in saying you can have guns, but only certain categories of firearms. You can't have guns superior to the military. You can have certain firearms here. However, to actually practically get your firearm in Mexico, there's a lot of paperwork. There's only one shop in the whole of the country which sells guns legally, new guns. It's controlled by the Mexican military. You go in there, you go in that shop, you have to hand in your cell phone, hand in your all your kind of paperwork, go through metal detectors like going in a prison. You go and look at these guns, and then you have to give in 7 pieces of paperwork, including a letter from your employer and a letter from the police saying you have no criminal record. When you get all this stuff, you can get the firearm. It takes several months, and then it's going to be registered with them. But the cartels don't do that. The cartels buy them in the US.
Right, they buy them in the US.
Now, there are other people buying guns in Mexico as well. Now, I mean, one of the groups who bought a lot of guns illegally were these groups of vigilantes or self-defense squads. Mm-hmm. So you start getting an arms race where you do get people saying, well, look, we're going to fight the cartels. So we're going to buy a bunch of guns and get our relatives who are in the US to buy guns and bring them down to us as well. So I'm going to get them to send me an AR-15, AK-47, and I'm going to stand up and fight the cartel. So you do get other people there. You do get some private citizens. They might have somebody living in the US, and so I'm going to go home to Michoacan, and I'm going to, I'll buy a gun and take it home and give it as a Christmas present to my brother. So you do get other people bringing the guns south as well, but it's the cartels who are buying these vast amounts. And we're talking about, often it's known as ant traffic, that is these little amounts going down, like these kind of 12 to 15 guns. I talked to all kinds of people involved in the trafficking business. I talked to one guy who was working for the US government, or he was working for a US company laying cable. He was an American citizen, had a US government ID to cross the border, and he was bringing down in his truck a bunch of guns.
This is like a side hustle for him. He's like, I'm here to fix some telecom phone lines, but every time I come down, I bring down 15 rifles and just sell them on the side of the road.
It was even more in his case. He was bringing and he was bringing them in the boxes, the company trucks, using the ID. And that was he said he was into it. He started making some quite decent money by the end. And he also, in fact, got involved in spying on the border patrol and using this kind of equipment. He was kind of a tech nerd as well. So kind of spying on different border patrol staff and reporting all of their locations to the cartel. But he said he kind of did it for the adrenaline was one of the things that he said. And he said it was kind of funny. He said one of the things that he was pissed off about, this is going back to the 90s, and he got involved, and he was pissed off about Tupac being killed.
That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah, I know. But what we all have, they all have this kind of stuff. I kind of relate to it at a human level, that kind of stuff. You can understand somebody thinking that.
How old was he? That's something a child would think. Like, that's a 17-year-old tough guy mindset.
In his 20s, he's like, I'm pissed off about Tupac being killed. Fuck the world. I'm going to traffic guns to Mexico. Well, yeah, which is obviously, not the the best defense in court.
No, but I assume you talked to this guy because he's in prison and regretting his actions or something.
That guy didn't get caught. Guy didn't get caught. So he had a very interesting story, and he gave a lot of details. But anyway, so you get sometimes these ant traffic or all kinds of different people moving these guns. Sometimes these big amounts. There was one time there was a truck with 147 firearms in, 147 AK-47s, all going, and that was actually caught by the ATF. They were watching this, and their operations get very interesting, as Fast as Furious shows. That was heading into Laredo, Texas. Laredo, Texas to Nuevo Laredo, Mexico.
So your book did dispel some ideas for me. Like I originally assumed some gun traffickers, or most gun traffickers, were these giant operations that we picture when we think about gun trafficking and arms trafficking. Something out of Die Hard, a dude on a yacht delivering loads of thousands of weapons covered by a burlap blanket, right, from former Soviet republics or two former Soviet republics. But it's not. It's like, it sounds like it's a dude driving across the Rio Grande down to Mexico with a Toyota Camry or a AT&T truck and a trunk full of guns.
I think this gets some the real big issues of understanding a lot of the violence around the world today, a lot of the wars, and a lot of the kind of what we see in Mexico and other countries, this weird hybrid between crime and war. So for a lot of people who are like in the kind of think tank complex about this, trying to look at this, they like to kind of divide this. Okay, we've got two boxes, two areas. We've got the traditional wars and the traditional gun traffickers, kind of gun runners to wars, which we can talk about, and we can look and try and have, stop like North Korea building guns and selling them to terrorist groups, whatever, Iran, these kind of things. And then we have, domestic crime and these criminals moving guns, and somebody, in a parking lot selling some guns in Baltimore, Maryland. We actually find these things are linked, and we've seen a kind of leveling out of this. Now, one thing is with the type of weapons, and when you get into the AR-15s or the M16s, the AK-47s, and you see a lot of these same guns, basically the same guns, sold in domestically as well as used in these war zones. Now, there's the issue, of course, that the AK-47 and the AR-15 domestic versions are semi-automatic. But then you realize that in Mexico, they can very easily convert them to fully automatic. But also that distinction really between semi-automatic and fully automatic, these days in war zones themselves, they're not really using fully automatic fire because everyone's got the capacity for that. They're now like more trying to preserve and fighting in a different way anyway.
Yeah, well, we don't have trench warfare as much, right? So you don't need to lay down machine gun fire from Normandy.
Just like spray it anymore. So nowadays it's like things like this kind of tight urban warfare, things like Fallujah or that kind of stuff, or you know, some of the fighting around these cities in Ukraine right now. So it's not people just like spraying everyone, you know, so you're not going to waste all your ammo. Whereas if you do take fully automatic into and then, you know, you can look even at the mass shootings and say, well, you know, you look at the mass shooting in Paris, in the Bataclan in Paris, the disco there, where they got some guns which were Zastava made, Yugoslav rifles, exactly, sprayed on the people there, and just like you're just firing automatic a bunch of sitting ducks, literally. But then you can see somebody firing with semi-automatic fire, like the attacker in the Florida disco some years ago, where he was using semi-automatic, and he was actually being more efficient in a way, in terms of bullets and massacring people. So that's actually complicated anyway, that distinction there. But we do see these similar weapons. So, you know, you have AK-47, these rifles, which are used, that can be used by an Islamic State group in Syria, or by a cartel in Mexico, or by a mass shooter in the United States. So kind of leveling out of these type of firearms across these situations of crime, terror, and war. And then you see these same networks involved. Now, like I say, this traffic of United States to Mexico is complicated. It would be easier if it was these big James Bond villains.
Right.
One of them being Victor Bout, one of these alleged James Bond villains is the Russian Victor Bout, who was bringing a whole bunch of heavy guns to Africa following the fall of the Soviet Union. Interestingly, as a side note there, he's now, they're looking at potentially trading him. He's in prison in the United States, trading him to get an American free from Russia in a trade right now. But it's a lot of the time these other smaller criminals working as part of these big organized crime networks.
Right. It would be easier to interdict this if it was one organization, or even smaller numbers. Hey, this is something state sponsored. It's coming up from Nicaragua, and it's military. The military is involved, and we can see them on our satellites. No, it's 3,000 different people transporting 25 or 50 or 100 guns at a time, over and over and over again. It's just like you said, ant traffic. You know, you can't just squish the ant that's in the front of the line, or you just can't get them all, right? You can't get them all. Hey, if you like what you're hearing and seeing, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There's a lot more just like this. You can find the Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, back to the show. You said earlier the ATF can't use digitized databases for guns. That's because of political, it's in their charter or something like that, a regulation, right? It's not that they can't. I'm trying to think of any good reason why that would be the case.
Yeah, so that's written. That was actually defined in the code following a law under Reagan, which was kind of protecting gun owners, protecting gun businesses, particularly. So one of the things there, part of the code of that law, was to say you can't have searchable databases. So you look at you've had this kind of fight back and forth about all these different things, and you realize all these things that happen with gun legislation. So a lot of what we have, like really the forming of the modern ATF, the background checks or the forms before they were actually made with the instant background check system, the actual forms themselves, this comes from like 1968, and the Gun Control Act then. And then you have this kind of backlash to that. Another interesting thing out of this is, you go back before, and it's only quite recently the guns have been this very politicized culture war issue. in the United States.
Yeah.
So, you go back to the origins of the National Rifle Association, and they're originally formed in New York. They weren't formed, in where you might think, Mississippi. They were formed in New York. One of the people, they were both Civil War veterans, but people who fought with the North. One of them had worked at the New York Times, one of the founders of the NRA.
That's I don't know why. That's the irony. That's crazy.
It's amazing, isn't it? So and they began and decided they actually initially that they realized that in the Civil War, a lot of the Northern soldiers couldn't shoot. They couldn't shoot straight. So like we need to have some rifle training. Americans
we still have that problem.
Yeah, they can't shoot straight. And then as they moved on, they were like into like promoting things like Olympic shooting and that kind of thing. And they were totally in favor of gun regulation. 1934, you had this act then, which particularly was after you had the kind of the gangsters, Al Capone style massacres, and a lot of the Tommy guns, spraying into speakeasies with Tommy guns. And that's when that's actually when you stopped being able to buy, or even then they made it a weird thing of limiting how people can buy machine guns, fully automatic guns. Even then they made it a weird thing that you could still buy them. You had to pay a machine gun tax and be fingerprinted and photographed. And so some people know, like if you talk to the you can still buy these, machine guns now. There's really, weird things there. But right through, you had even the 1968 Act, you still had the NRA in favor of it. And then in the 70s, you started seeing a reaction, and a reaction particularly to the idea of rising crime in cities, to these various things. And you start seeing more militant, these militant groups. And this guy called Harlan Carter took over the NRA. And now with a very interesting story, this guy, he actually shot dead a Mexican teenager when he was 17 years old and later got away with it.
Oh, wow.
And he was that much more militant side. And then you've seen since then the kind of NRA develop and this idea of kind of no compromise at all. Now, I will say that I do think now, one of the difficulties now, and looking at the US climate right now, despite we kind of get into the bigger picture of American politics, but like how is it that the US now is still incapable of kind of moving on this issue?
Mm-hmm.
And so you still have, this issue of the NRA becoming extremely adept at stopping any kind of movement. So universal background checks, which would stop that idea of, abusing the private sale loophole. Surveys show there's very, very big support for universal background checks, things like 89%, including among gun owners, including among conservatives. And they can't move on that because the NRA are very good at lobbying on that and stopping any movement on that issue. But I do think on the other side as well, that the Democrats, I was wondering when I published my book in last year, if it would almost be too late. This issue had become quite hot of firearms and this issue of, universal background checks, and they would have already moved on those issues by the time my book was published. Thinking this is they've got big support for this. Hasn't happened. And it seems on many issues, the Democrats, despite, they when they won both houses, despite having, a lot of power, cultural power, corporate power, have been very bad at forging any real agenda to do things, kind of pragmatic, practical things that finding that a middle ground can agree on.
Yeah. No, it's for every American, this is frustrating. No matter which side of this you're on, you're frustrated with this right now, especially the result of, or the lack of results. It's really infuriating. I do want to talk a little bit about Fast and Furious, just very brief, what happened? People have heard about this.
Sure.
Besides the movie franchise, what happened? Yeah. What was the original idea here?
Yeah. Amazing case. So you have, for people who don't know anything about this, the first, the kind of background, and then I could talk about some of my research and really what happened here. So the bigger the story that broke out is you had the ATF in Arizona, out of Phoenix, Arizona, watching a group of these straw buyers that I mentioned working with a cartel or working with gangsters in Mexico to supply various cartels with firearms. And they were sitting there watching this and doing nothing. They were not stopping these guns going down to the cartels in Mexico. They were watching as this group bought 500 guns, then 1,000 guns, then 1,500 guns, and then 2,000 guns. Eventually, this blew up when one of these guns was used in the murder, or one of these guns was captured from a group of gangsters who were involved in the murder of a elite border patrol agent from the BORTAC unit in Arizona, Brian Terry. And after Brian Terry's death, there started to be some leaks, and this story blew up. It blew up to a very, very big political story. Immediately, there was a lot of conspiracy theories came about this, or people were thinking this had to be a bigger thing. The bigger conspiracy in the United States side was had to be the Obama administration deliberately doing this to make the kind of gun owners look bad. On the Mexican side, people were saying, well, look at the United States. They deliberately want to destabilize Mexico. They're deliberately selling these guns, pushing these guns down to Mexico. And then other people kind of more involved in this start saying, well, wait a minute, these guns are going to the Sinaloa cartel, particularly, of Chapo Guzman. Is there some kind of deal between the American government and the Sinaloa cartel? Now, I went into this pretty deeply. I got, a lot of the papers. I talked to the confidential informant. I talked to the Mexican president at the time, Felipe Calderon, about this, and got pretty deep into this. And I do believe it was a botched operation as opposed to something conspiratorial. Now, I do think there were certain conspiratorial actions afterwards to try and cover it up. So I do think later they're like, everyone's kind of running away, trying to cover up themselves, and they start to behave in kind of more conspiratorial ways. And the basic operation itself, it was a botched operation that comes from two main reasons. One is that you see these federal operations, these federal agents, over a lot of years have got into these kind of things. And you look at, what are the ATF doing? They're doing these kind of deep stings where they penetrate biker gangs and they pretend to be bikers. What do DEA agents do? They get in with drug traffickers, pretend to be drug traffickers. You watch drug traffickers move packets of heroin. You're watching that heroin, which eventually goes and kills people, or watch them move fentanyl to try and build a case. Mm-hmm. So it kind of reflects a bigger thing of how federal agents operate in this environment, which can be in very, very suspect ways. Another thing is simply the level of trafficking that's happening. I mean, people say, well, or the NRA argument, this was deliberately done to make the gun industry look bad. I mean, it was done. It could happen because this trafficking was such a large scale. They could simply sit there in Arizona, watch a bunch of these guys, and they could see 2,000 guns be trafficked because it's such a huge thing. And the opposite effect happened than this making the gun industry look bad. This, for a decade, knocks the issue of Mexican guns being trafficked, of American drugs being trafficked to Mexico, off the agenda. For 10 years, it was off the agenda. Now it's back on. Now, in fact, you've got the Mexican government filing a lawsuit against American gun companies. You've got this issue much more in the news now, the kind of consciousness about it. But it had the opposite effect of making, of actually clamping down on guns. It actually made, everyone scared of touching the issue.
Yeah, it's interesting how this blew up. There was almost 2,000 weapons. Most of them are still missing. A lot of people thought it was some grand conspiracy, like you said, but it turned out to just be sort of a bungled ATF operation. I saw that you wrote that guns in the United States outnumber the next 25 countries combined in terms of the number of guns, which, I mean, I knew we had a lot, but that's bonkers. So what was interesting about this was, since we have such effective law enforcement here in the United States, on the whole, I know people are going to be like, what about, that aside, we keep some of this violence in check because we have responses. The police, if you show up to a bank to rob a bank and you got hostages in there, or you are robbing a bank with a rifle, I mean, the SWAT team is going to come and they're going to chase you and they're going to kick down your door and they're not going to stop till they find you. There's going to be helicopters. You know, as evidenced by the news, there's some holes in this, but countries adjacent to us, such as Mexico, that don't have as effective law enforcement, they suffer the consequences of the number of guns. So they have the number of guns per capita, right, minus the stability of law and order. So that was an interesting equation, right? Like, it's not just the number of guns, it's the number of guns minus the police presence, or minus law and order, or minus effective judges, trials, prisons, and things like that. Corruption plus corruption. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. I think it's a very central point when you look at this. I mean, America, United States of America, it's a country I love and a fascinating country with a lot of, I think, paradoxes. And one of them is this: that in the United States, and there's discussion about this now following Uvalde shooting. Then people are also looking, well, there's a lot of mass shootings or shootings happening every weekend in Philadelphia and Chicago. Look at this issue of violence in the United States, and it does have levels that are unlike, very, very different from many European countries. Homicide levels, shooting levels, number of guns, all of these things. However, and it's sitting here within the American continent. However, it's very, very different also from Mexico, from Jamaica, from Guatemala, El Salvador, Venezuela, that it has a very powerful law enforcement institutions. Now, there's a lot of issues with them, but they're very powerful. So you had this in the United States where it said, okay, we've got a lot of guns in the hands of criminals and a lot of guns in the hands of regular citizens. But, they got, you have, criminals, drug dealers in the United States who have a lot more guns than, say, drug dealers in Europe. And there's a lot more shootings over selling drugs in the United States. But then also have this very, very hard law enforcement hitting down like a hammer on this. So then you have 2 million people in prison and these kind of very hard law enforcement. Now, there is and there has been a selectivity to law enforcement in the United States. And I think you do need a selectivity. But an idea of going after violent criminals, or particularly criminals who fight with law enforcement. I mean, if you fire at law enforcement, if you shoot cops in the United States, they're going to go after you, put you in prison. In Mexico, you can kill, or in Central America, you can get away with killing 30, 40, 50 people, and they can start shooting the police left, right, and center, and then you end up in this kind of crazy situation. So the United States, so if you look at these things, like if where you can go in the United States, you can buy a 50 caliber rifle. You see these 50 caliber rifles, and they fire these bullets, the size of the small Coca-Cola bottles or small knives. And in the United States, they're not using those to fire at cop cars, because if criminals generally know if they did that, they'd end up in prison for life.
Yeah.
In Mexico, because they're overwhelming law enforcement, they're just overwhelming it, or they're working with them or whatever, they will use those. And there's a whole bunch of incidents where they'll sit on the side of a hill, sit in a place, or on a street, and they'll fire those bang, bang into cop cars, into military vehicles. So again, you really start to get, there's this video of when a bunch of gangsters took over a city of Culiacan, Sinaloa, where they literally blew the leg off this soldier. You can see a video of his leg being blown off with one of these 50 cal bullets. So
is that when El Chapo's son got arrested and they made the... So can you briefly... This is the craziest thing ever. I guess the police or the Marina or whatever went in, military, right? And went in and they busted him, and maybe they didn't even know he was there. I'm not sure if they knew back then. There was some doubt, like maybe they ran into him and went, holy crap, we got the big boss's kid here. This is crazy. They arrested him, and then somehow that kid and his people managed to call so much backup that they blocked off the whole city, surrounded the military barracks, had a standoff, set up roadblocks, checkpoints, brought in so many fighters with so many guns that the government had to surrender, and they let him go.
Yeah, so I've looked into a lot of that case, since then, and looked at what I could understand about what happened with the operation. And it seems actually it began with, the extradition order being asked coming from the United States. We want to go after Ovidio Guzman. Now, in the US, the law enforcement agencies are pissed because these Chapitos, these sons of El Chapo, have taken over El Chapo's empire and are moving huge amounts, particularly of synthetic drugs, of opioids, of fentanyl, which is, causing huge amounts of death in the United States.
Right.
So they really want to go after these guys. And so they get the extradition order comes down. It goes to Mexico. Now you have in Mexico these channels so that these orders can come through and not really be revealed, because otherwise there's so much corrupt law enforcement. They're just going to tell someone's going to phone them up and say, there's an arrest coming for you. Go and hide in the hills for a few days. So you manage to get this kind of coming around so that a lot of even the higher levels of law enforcement or the president and the president secretary of public security, they don't know about this. And you have this special military unit, anti-narcotics unit, who's got this order. But then they get this backup. Now, I initially thought they went in there with way too few people, but it's not actually as few as it first appeared. They actually went in there with over 100 military and police. And it seems like a reasonable operation when you go into this house, in Culiacan, and you go in there and you kind of, we're meant to take him out, secure the area, and then take him to the airport. It seems like a reasonable operation.
Yeah.
But as they go in there, immediately the gunmen of Ovidio Guzman, the line of defense, start breaking out and start engaging and fighting with the military and the police people. So then you start getting this fight, and so you get they get to the house, they can't get him out. You see this amazing video where they go in there and he comes out of there, and they say, look, tell your call your gunman off. And he gets on the phone, but then his other brothers are there and they're like, no, we're not backing down. So then you get this escalation. Now you've got about 100 police and military initially, and you've got various guys from the Chapitos, probably the same number immediately in these areas around. I mean, I've just been filming in Culiacan, and the number of these, just cartel guys on motorcycles around the city is quite amazing. I mean, they've got a lot of people there. So then they start escalating. They get more military out and they get more cartel gunmen out. And with a few hours, it's escalated. So this is according to the military. You have about 350 soldiers and 700 to 800 cartel gunmen.
Wow. So they're 2-to-1, outnumbered 2-to-1.
Yeah. So right now, not only that. Now, what's amazing is how, I mean, these are gangsters. These are ostentatious gangsters. You see them on videos, and they're guys who go to table dance clubs and take drugs, but they're very effective at, that's a modern insurgency tactic. I mean, that'd be the envy of, guerrilla groups around the world.
Yeah.
You get 700 to 800 gunmen on the street within hours who are fighting the military, engaging the military. Now, not only that, they also go to where the houses of the families of the military are. So they go in there, but and then there's women and children are there, the wives, the kids, and they're all pushing out. They're storming in there as well, and they kidnap various soldiers. Now you get to a certain point where then they get to the government level, and they get to the Secretary of Public Security, and ask the president himself, and they say we're going to back down. Now there's a lot of questions about how corrupt the government is as well, particularly that guy who was the public security secretary, who's now the governor of Sonora. But either way, when you talk to some people in the city of Culiacan, and there's people there who went to pick up their kids from school, and they were sitting there hiding in the schools. A lot of them were like, yeah, it was good the government backed down, because otherwise we could have all been massacred. Now that situation, it shows obviously that there's a very irregular situation, but it is trafficking of firearms to effectively an armed conflict, a weird type of armed conflict that's happening in Mexico. Now, when there's some people from the right coming out with this idea of, they say we should call the cartels terrorists. Now, I do agree that some of their actions can be considered terroristic actions and acts of terror. But I just replied to some of these guys, saying, okay, if you want to do that, it's a double-edged sword. If you want to classify them as terrorist groups, then the people who are selling guns to these groups, it's not going to be probation.
Right.
They could do 25 years or more. You're supplying material to a terrorist group. This happened following the shooting in San Bernardino, because the guy was a shooting in San Bernardino. The guy was affiliated to the Islamic State. The guy supplying the guns, and they're saying, well, you can do 25 years. You're supplying a terrorist group. Also, though, the people who are arriving at the US border and saying, I want to seek asylum in the United States because I'm fleeing cartel violence. Right now, a lot of these cases, they'll say, well, look, it's not our problem if there's a, we're sorry, there's a lot of criminals in Mexico and you have to flee the cartel. But that's a law enforcement issue. But if they're saying, I'm fleeing a US classified terrorist group that wants to kill me, it can be harder for the judge to throw that court out.
That's a good point. So it could cause a refugee crisis, because then we have to let people in by law. Well, I mean, that changes the equation anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's already a refugee crisis. There's already a serious refugee situation on the southern border. It's been big, particularly for the last 10 years, basically. It goes up and down. They stop it temporarily. It comes back up again. It's be big again this summer. And a lot of that's connected to this violence that's happening in Mexico, in El Salvador, and Honduras. But it would only add an extra, if people want to try and classify them as terrorist groups.
Take us on a journey with an illegal gun. I know this could take a while, but like the brief version, design and manufacturing in, I don't know, Eastern Europe or whatever, and then it ends up being used in a crime in Mexico. Yeah,
absolutely. So I'll talk through one which I followed, actually, totally followed it in the book, looking at the serial number. So we have this gun, and we look at these AK-47s. Now, it's interesting when you get, where does actually a gun begin? Because then you get to, okay, the gun is made on this certain date, but then you get to the design of the gun and the factory, so then you get to the whole history of AK-47s, which is kind of fascinating, and why these factories in Eastern Europe are selling these guns around the world. But let's, we could talk about the AK-47 was made in the Cold War. The Soviets started establishing them in different places, and they would actually move them to their allies around the world. The Americans built the AR-15, the AR-15 stroke M16, the combat, and they gave it to their own allies. So then you had both of these sides until you have these kind of rifles around the world. So you have this factory in Kujia, Romania, which has been making AK-47s. And then in 2011, it rolled off one of these AK-47 rifles made for the US market, which have been slightly adjusted. So they have certain rules to try and get to the US market. They adjusted them to classify them as sporting rifles. And this, being made in Kujia, was then taken in and imported into Vermont, of all places. so like, you think of, like, again, big gun states, Vermont suddenly has this company, big warehouses of a company there importing AK-47s, taken there, but then from there taken to Texas. In this particular case, it went to Texas to a pawn shop, and it was sold along with 9 other guns in this sale, which I mentioned earlier. A guy walks in and buys 10 AK-47s. He was an Iraq War veteran, hit hard times. He was buying them, and he was paid $600 to buy these 10 AK-47s, so $60 a rifle in that particular one. For a guy he was buying weed off, buying marijuana off.
Okay.
They'd given him the $600, handed him the rifles. Now, this guy was buying weed off, was also buying marijuana and also other drugs from the Zetas, who are a very heavy crime group from Mexico. So this guy supplies these guns to the Zetas. They bring them down, drive them over the border into Mexico, drive them to a place called San Luis Potosí, where they end up with a group of these Zeta guys in San Luis Potosí. Now, so this gun, we've gone through this whole history of being, made in Romania to being with these through the United States and being with a bunch of gangsters in San Luis Potosí. Now, they're there one day when a car with diplomatic American plates, US plates, is driving through their territory. And it has two US agents, Jaime Zapata and Victor Avila, who are driving down in this car with US plates, taking some radio or delivered some radio tap gear for an operation. Now they suddenly get what's called a mobile roadblock, where you have these two cars, force them off the road, have all these guns, and they're in an armored vehicle. But when they stop the car, it has this malfunction that it unlocks when they stop the car.
The doors unlock when it stops. I heard about this, actually. I think I heard about this. That is
So these guys surround a car, and suddenly one of these setas finds out, oh my God, the door opens. So there's like a struggle. They slam the door shut, look for to press a thing to lock it. And when they do that, the window winds down a few centimeters. So this guy sticks a gun through the window and sprays. The guy in the driver's seat takes 5 bullets. The guy in the next seat next to him takes 3. Now they still afterwards come out, still drive around to the front. So one of the guy he dies. This guy Jaime Zapata, he dies. Victor Avila, he's still alive. He's still conscious at this point, but he's playing dead with her. The guys drive out to the front of the car, spray it some more. This guy eventually they go. The helicopter comes. They come. He manages to get on his phone and calls up the U.S. Embassy. It's a very chilling recording of this phone call, which says, "We are shot. We are shot." His wife happened to be at the embassy. She was also working there. Somebody hearing her husband's voice. They send in the helicopters, get him out. He's taken to the US and survives this. And then he eventually will sue ICE over this, and there'll be a big kind of court case. But that's the story of, and he still, just to finish that story, he, at the journey of that gun, he survives it, but he has some pretty serious wounds from the bullet wounds. And one of the bullet wounds, they can't even remove the bullet completely, and he still has that. And it's how those shootings happen very, very fast, but the effects can be a lifetime. You can be injured, you can destroy your life, destroy your job if you survive.
I wanted to do that because I know that people, the problem with some of these guns, right, is that it's not like drugs where they're illegal from the start of the chain of the product. They're illegal. Drug trafficking is illegal at all points in the chain because the product is illegal. Gun trafficking is different because the product diverts from a legal industry, which makes it a hell of a lot harder to combat. And there's no specific law, if I'm correct here, there's no specific law on international gun trafficking per se. There are definitely laws against distributing firearms willy-nilly, except for the one that we just talked about. That's a loophole. But with drugs, it's like, hey, if you're caught with this, any amount of it, it's illegal. Large amounts of it, it's a stronger punishment. With guns, you got to prove the guns are illegal, that they're not able to be held by that person, that they're not able to be moved by that person, sold by that person. I mean, it makes it so much harder. I heard that there are online marketplaces. These are illegal, obviously. Online marketplaces where people show things like boats for sale, but the ads are all written in some kind of code so the buyers know that it's a gun and what type it is. Have you heard about this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's a very good point about you have heroin. You grow the opium illegally in Mexico. It goes to a lab where it's illegally processed into heroin. It's illegally transported into the United States, and it's illegally sold in the corner. So all parts of the chain is illegal, and you have very strong anti-drug trafficking laws. Now they've failed for, I think, some of the reasons we talked about in the last episode. But you do have, you can throw these guys in prison for a very long time. Conspiracy to traffic drugs and federal offenses. With firearms, and because you're policing a legal industry and then this kind of illegal firearms industry, this illegal selling on corners kind of thing. So you actually there's no federal firearms trafficking law. They haven't got that. So a lot of the actual, when we talk about straw buying, one of the reasons it's only probation, the actual law is not, firearms trafficking, it's lying on a form. A lot of these guys who are selling guns to cartels in quite a big way, they're not done for firearms trafficking. They're done for selling firearms without a license. So again, this kind of weird thing there. Now you mentioned before you jumped to an interesting point.
Yeah, the online marketplaces. I'm wondering, how did they figure that out, right? Obviously, they busted some people and they said, where did you get this? And he said, oh, I bought it on, the Craigslist for guns, and they look on there and it's only boats. What is that? Does that still operate?
Okay.
What is this?
Yeah, right. So you have some dedicated websites which sell guns. You can still buy guns on those websites.
Sure.
Now, again, you can avoid a lot of the time with private sellers. You can avoid background checks, avoid paperwork. Sometimes there's really obvious cases. There's one case when a guy was like going online, like really, one thing that I talked to people who sell guns illegally. Like one guy sold guns illegally in Baltimore, Maryland. One guy who sold guns illegally at the retail level here in Mexico City. And they say one thing that they see is if somebody's really desperate for a gun, they'll just put the price up. It's not really obvious. Somebody comes and goes, I need a gun. Give me a gun now. I need a gun. Give me a gun. And they call it every half hour. If you've got a gun. And it's obviously because, if somebody wants to kill him, normally, like somebody goes, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill you. And they're like, okay, I need a gun. So then I'm like desperate. So as soon as they do that, it's like for the gun sellers are, oh, great. Yeah, I've got a gun. It'll be $2,000. They're like, yeah, whatever. So if you talk about that in economic terms, it's a distressed buyer. A distressed buyer who does that. Now, you see some of that on these websites where you saw one case was like, need a gun right now, need a gun, we'll pay, and there's somebody sold him this guy an Uzi. He took the gun, went in and shot his ex-wife and a bunch of other women at a spa. He was desperate for it to go and kill his ex-wife. But I mean, it's like, so sometimes, and again, avoiding any paperwork about it. You still have those websites out there, but also you used to have selling guns on like Facebook pages.
Yeah, like the marketplace, Facebook marketplace.
Yeah, so just direct on Facebook. Now, Facebook eventually, after a bit of pressure, said, okay, we're not going to allow people to sell guns on our website anymore. But then there, people still they're like, got a nice gun case here. This gun case fits this gun exactly. And what they're really doing is hinting, I'm selling you the gun. Mm-hmm. So they kind of ways.
Right, it's like 13 times the price of a gun case, or 30 times the price of a gun case.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that way you can still find ways to buy guns there through those pages.
Jeez. Before you go, I'm curious about the 3D printed guns. Like, is this mostly hype? And then ghost guns, those are not the same thing, which I just learned. I thought those were the same thing. They're not. Yeah,
fascinating issue. So we've got two things here, as you rightly point out. And I think a lot of the media, journalists themselves didn't understand the story, and so kind of played into the hands of some of these people. I mean, I admit, getting into guns, covering guns. I didn't grow up with guns. It was a hard learning curve, but I wanted to make sure when I wrote this, I got really into trying to learn and understand technically what we're talking about. So with you have ghost guns as being like, as the ATF call them, unserialized firearms. Mm-hmm. So this ATF guy said to me, we shouldn't call them ghost guns, call them unserialized, unlicensed firearms. So to be honest, I appreciate that, but like I'm a journalist, we want to have phrases that people, ghost guns has alliteration.
Right, yeah. Ghost guns sounds good, and people will go, oh my gosh, ghosts are scary and guns are scary. It's ghost guns now, right?
Yeah, not unserialized, unlicensed firearms. It's like a bit of a mouth. But anyway, you had these going for a long time of buying kits to buy guns. So you can buy these kits off the internet. Beforehand, people were buying these like mail order kits going back to the 80s. But like the internet, these took off a lot more. So people selling these kits to buy guns. Now, sometimes as well, there's issues where you're still like buying whole guns, but then you can buy sometimes guns that are almost finished, but like 80% finished. So you still have to like So then you start getting into this discussions. Okay, what is a gun? Oh, I'm only selling this part of a gun. That's not a gun. I'm only selling this part. Then it's like there's only 80%. You take this and then you just drill a bit more of it and you could turn it. Now those were a big issue. In Los Angeles now, in California, you're seeing when I was there with the ATF there, did some research in the book in 2019, it was about 30 to 40% of their guns they were seizing from gangs, from criminals, were these ghost guns. Could be even higher now. And there's various cases of verified crimes, murders, where they've been doing these. Again, with the laws, it's kind of hard to actually prosecute these people. These people can be buying these, making them, selling them on the black market. It's quite hard to prosecute them and kind of find crime unless they've got like drugs as well or involved in kind of murders or felons or that kind of thing. Then you've got the 3D printed guns.
Yeah. That's even scarier because it's like then a high schooler can print this in their basement.
It sounds scary. Now you had this one that came out some years ago, and was this kind of plastic one done by this kind of guy who'd also been at law school himself. I think he'd be a law school dropout or a law school graduate, who made this thing, and he was talking very much about the kind of libertarian cause, and had this this 3D plastic gun, and it came out, and I think a lot of journalists kind of fell for it. Like, this is changing everything. It's really scary. Actually, the gun didn't really work. This first thing is like the thing about 3D printing is the cheap 3D printers. They use quite soft kind of plastic. It's not like super hard. People say, well, like a Glock is plastic. Well, a Glock's in fact not all plastic, and also it's like they got very, very hard factory methods.
Yeah, it's like a polymer that's all one piece cast somehow. It's not
making Glocks
drawn on with a freaking electronic crayon like a 3D printer, a cheap one anyway.
So you had these cheap 3D printers. They make these guns, and actually it's more of a threat to the guy firing it or the girl firing it than to the person. And so that was actually initially kind of a bit of a hype. I think the journalists kind of didn't, fell for it, and the gun rights people, the Second Amendment people, they understood it, but they were like quite happy. They're like, that will stop gun control. So they were like really, they kind of liked playing into, even though they know it didn't work. The guy who did that got a lot of hype, got a lot of fame. He was then selling a lot of actual ghost gun kits, as well as other internet ventures. Then he got kind of stung, maybe on a bit of maybe even kind of set up, but he got stung for having relations with an underage girl.
So you got it honey trapped.
Yeah. So that like that whole story of a kind of modern thing that went down. Then other people came into this and started creating new 3D printed guns, trying to solve this issue, and it kind of a more like kind of happening on a grassroots level. So you have these gun people, they call it the fuck gun control, FGC. Yeah, fuck gun control. And they have these like numbers, and they call it. Now, a lot of the time you realize, even though it's kind of hard to know, so you say, well, they're doing 3D printing, but you actually realize they're 3D printing some parts, but they're still buying some other parts.
Sure.
So they're not really fully 3D printed guns yet. We haven't got there yet. You still see some video, but you have to really be a bit suspicious about it, or ask questions about it. Someone goes, "Oh, I've made a 3D printing, it really works now." It's like you have to check: does it really? Is it really like you say that any 15-year-old is going to go to their dad's basement where he's got his 3D printer and then go, "Oh, dad," just like pressing the thing and putting come out with a new gun? That's not quite happening yet. By any means, will it happen? We'll see. Maybe, but it hasn't happened yet. We haven't seen it happen yet.
Man, thank you so much. This is super interesting stuff. Man, I really appreciate your time. This is always so interesting. And are you working on another book at all, or no?
I've got one potential book, and I've got like some right now. I'm working on 2 series. So that's my main thing. I've been on those for like the last 14 months, just coming to an end of that. Right after my last book was released, I was right into these TV series. So yeah, when I finish these TV series, I want to take a bit of a breath. maybe and kind of rethink about what I want to do next. But yeah, I've got some book ideas there.
Thanks for checking out this entire episode of The Jordan Harbinger Show. If you're interested in exploring this topic further, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There, we dive even deeper on this and many other topics. In the audio podcast, I also close open loops, cover things discussed off camera, off air, and give some parting lessons from our guest. You can find The Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, any podcast app, or at jordanharbinger.com. And also, if you found this episode useful, please share it with those you care about. Last but not least, like, comment, and subscribe.